Okay, so you want to own a funeral home, buy a building, hire a licensed director, and tap into the one product every single human being on Earth will eventually need. Here's the first number that should stop you before you go any further. The US funeral industry generates somewhere between $19 and $24 billion a year. It should be one of the most stable businesses on the planet. The customer base literally cannot opt out, and yet industry revenue has been shrinking for 5 straight years, declining at over 3% annually. There's a single word driving that entire decline, and if you don't understand it before you open your doors, you will price yourself out of business without ever figuring out why. Cremation. A traditional funeral generates $7,000 to $10,000 per family. A cremation, in the same building, with the same staff, under the same overhead, generates $2,000 to $5,000. Same front door, half the revenue or less. That gap is the entire story of this business. Understand it, and you understand modern funeral service. Miss it, and you can be busier than ever, serving more families than last year, and still be making less money than you were a decade ago. Let's talk about who's actually capturing the money in an industry this large. Service Corporation International, the largest deathcare company in North America, generated $4.31 billion in revenue in 2025, with a net income of $542.6 million, a margin around 12 to 13%. Here's what most families don't realize when they walk through the door of a funeral home with a warm, familiar, locally sounding name. SCI has spent decades quietly acquiring independent family-owned funeral homes across the country, and in the overwhelming majority of cases, it keeps the original family name on the sign. The ownership changed, the building, the name, and the feeling of local, personal service didn't. That's not a scandal. It's a deliberate, successful strategy. But it means the true competitive landscape of this industry isn't independents versus corporations that look corporate. It's independents versus corporations dressed as independents, with a $4 billion balance sheet and professional pricing discipline behind the family name on the door. So before you spend a single dollar, you need to understand that not all funeral revenue is the same business wearing a different hat. Traditional burial services carry a gross margin of 50 to 65%, driven heavily by casket and merchandise markup. Cremation services, now chosen by the majority of American families, carry gross margins of just 15 to 30%, sometimes reaching 50%, only when a family adds a full ceremonial package on top of it. The industry-wide shift toward cremation isn't just a cultural change, it's a structural margin compression happening to every single operator in this business at once, whether they've noticed it in their own numbers yet or not. Now, what does it actually cost to open the doors? A typical single-location funeral home generates around $1.9 million in annual revenue, with net margins of 10 to 15% for most operators and up to 20% for top performers, meaning average annual net profit typically falls between $109,000 and $218,000. Getting to that point requires real capital, the building and land, prep room and embalming equipment, a hearse and family limousine, and if you're running your own crematory instead of outsourcing it, a retort alone can run into 6 figures. Then come the licenses. Most states require a combined funeral director and embalmer license, which typically demands an associate's degree in mortuary science, 1 to 3 years of apprenticeship, and a state board exam, putting real time between deciding to enter this business and being legally allowed to run it. Here's the trap inside the trap, and it has nothing to do with the building or the hearse. It's preneed. Families increasingly prepay for their own funerals years, sometimes decades in advance. And state law typically requires that 70 to 100% of that money be deposited into a state-regulated trust account, not kept as operating cash. In Washington state, it's 90%. In Maryland, cemeteries must trust 50% immediately and another 5% once the contract is paid in full. Some states, like New York, require the full 100%, principal and interest, to remain the legal property of the consumer, not the funeral home, until the day the service is actually performed. Here's what that means in practice. A family pays you $8,000 today for a funeral you might not perform for another 20 years. You don't get to touch that money. It sits in a trust you don't control, growing at whatever the trustee's investment strategy earns, while your actual operating costs, payroll, the building, insurance, arrive every single month regardless. You've made a sale. You haven't made $1 of usable cash. This is exactly why so many funeral homes push insurance-funded pre-need contracts instead of trust-funded ones. Insurance-backed pre-need generates real commission income for the funeral home immediately, typically around 12% of the contract for a paid-in-full policy, and as much as 25% for a multi-pay plan, which helps operating cash flow today in exchange for locking in tomorrow's pricing at today's numbers. It's a genuinely useful tool. It's also a quiet incentive to prioritize cash flow this quarter over the actual economics of the contract 20 years from now. And that tension sits underneath the entire pre-need side of this industry. There's a second structural mechanism worth understanding: the FTC funeral rule, federal law since 1984. It requires funeral homes to provide an itemized general price list to any family that asks, and prohibits forcing a family to buy a full package when they only want specific services. Sounds like consumer protection, and it is, but it also means a funeral home can't quietly bundle its way around its own thinning cremation margins. Every price is visible, comparable, and shoppable, in an industry where families are, for obvious reasons, deeply reluctant to shop around in the moment they actually need the service. Now here's a real company, a real name, and one of the most dramatic collapses in the history of this industry, because nothing teaches this lesson better than watching it happen to a company that once looked unstoppable. Meet the Loewen Group. Raymond Loewen took over his father's single funeral home in Fort Frances, Ontario, in the late 1960s. Under his leadership starting in 1985, Loewen pursued one of the most aggressive acquisition strategies corporate North America had ever seen in this industry, eventually buying over 1,100 funeral homes and 400 cemeteries, funded almost entirely through debt. In 1995, a Mississippi funeral home operator named Jerry O'Keefe sued Loewen over a broken business agreement. The jury, in a case that became a landmark study in litigation risk, awarded O'Keefe between $100 million and $400 million in damages, enough to wipe out the company's entire net worth. The presiding judge then ruled Loewen had to post a bond of 125% of the award, roughly $625 million, within 1 week just to keep appealing. Loewen settled instead. Rather than slowing down, the company kept acquiring, buying Prime Succession, the largest private funeral home operator in North America, for roughly $295 to $320 million in 1996, partly to build enough scale to fend off a hostile takeover bid from its biggest rival, Service Corporation International, in 1997. By 1998, Loewen's total liabilities were 6 times larger than its market value. By mid-1999, total debt reached approximately $2.3 billion, including $1 billion maturing almost immediately, and the company posted a $599 million net loss for the year. On June 1, 1999, the Loewen Group filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in both the United States and Canada. It emerged in 2002 under a new name, Loewen Group. In November of 2006, Loewen was acquired for $1.2 billion by SCI, the same rival it had gone deep into debt, trying to fend off a decade earlier. So how does a company that grew from one small-town funeral home into one of the largest death care operators in North America end up swallowed by the very competitor it was trying to outrun? The answer isn't that Loewen ran bad funeral homes. The underlying businesses it bought were, individually, perfectly ordinary, profitable local operations. The answer is structural. Loewen grew almost entirely through debt-funded acquisition in an industry with real but modest organic growth. And when a single litigation shock hit, the kind of tail risk that exists in any business dealing with grieving, financially vulnerable customers, the company had no cushion left to absorb it, because every dollar of capacity was already committed to paying for the last acquisition and funding the next one. It's the exact same forces already sitting inside your own business plan if you're not careful. Growth funded by leverage instead of earned cash flow, in an industry where the revenue side is structurally declining as cremation keeps rising. Keep that in mind the next time buying up 3 competing funeral homes in your county looks like the obvious way to grow. So who actually wins in this business? Almost never the operator treating every pre-need sale as identical cash regardless of funding method, blind to the difference between a trust-funded contract that locks up capital for decades and an insurance-funded one that pays a commission today. It's the funeral homes that have genuinely diversified across traditional burial, cremation with a full ceremonial upsell, and merchandise, instead of relying on the traditional burial margins of a generation ago that keep shrinking as a share of total business every single year. It's the operators disciplined enough to track trust compliance as carefully as a construction company tracks retainage, because a state board audit finding underfunded pre-need trusts doesn't just cost money. In most states, it can cost you your license entirely. And it's the ones who understand that in a declining revenue industry, growth through acquisition has to be funded conservatively, in cash and modest debt, not through the kind of leverage that turned Raymond Loewen's life's work into his rival's acquisition target. An owner's income in this business, like most capital-intensive small businesses, comes from a working salary plus a year-end profit distribution. On the industry average $1.09 million revenue single-location home, that typically nets an owner-operator somewhere between $109,000 and $218,000 total, depending on service mix and operational discipline. Owners who've built a genuinely diversified, trust-compliant, multi-location operation can scale well beyond that. But the gap between the median owner and the thriving one was never about how many families they served. It was whether they understood the difference between a traditional burial dollar and a cremation dollar walking through the exact same front door. Now let's run the numbers two ways, because seeing them side by side is more convincing than any warning I could give you. The optimistic scenario, you're running a single location funeral home doing $1.1 million in annual revenue, with a service mix that's kept traditional burial relationships strong through genuine community reputation, cremation services upsold into full ceremonies rather than treated as a bare minimum transaction, and pre-need trust compliance handled precisely to the letter of your state's law. At an 18% net margin, that's roughly $198,000 in profit for the year, a strong, sustainable outcome. The realistic scenario, your service mix has quietly drifted, the way it has industry-wide, from 55% burial towards 65% direct cremation, with no upsell, without you fully repricing your overhead to match. A slow local economy pushes families toward the cheapest package on your itemized price list, as the FTC rule entitles them to choose. Your pre-need sales stayed strong on paper, but most of that cash sits locked in trust, unusable for today's payroll. Run that same $1.1 million in revenue through that reality, and your margin doesn't land at 18%. It lands closer to 8 or 10%, while your visible case count, the number that makes an owner feel busy and successful, can be flat or even climbing the entire time. So is owning a funeral home worth it? It offers something genuinely rare, a customer base that will never disappear, in a role that carries real community trust and real meaning. But it demands an owner who understands the difference between a traditional burial dollar and a cremation dollar, who treats pre-need trust compliance with the same seriousness a construction company treats a bonding requirement, and who never mistakes case volume for revenue, or revenue for cash actually sitting in the operating account. Every number in this script, the shrinking industry revenue, the trust laws locking up capital for decades, the debt that turned one of the largest deathcare companies in history into its own rival's acquisition, exists for one reason. It filters out the people who wanted to serve grieving families from the people who actually understand the business behind serving them. The building, the license, and the family name on the sign are the easy part. What separates the funeral home still thriving in year 20 from the one quietly absorbed into a larger competitor's portfolio was never the quality of the service at the funeral. It was whether the owner understood exactly where, in an industry slowly shrinking beneath their feet, the actual money was still standing still long enough to be earned.